Welcome everybody to tonight's webinar, The Economic Benefits of Open Space to Massachusetts Communities. We want to start off tonight's webinar by thanking the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation's Service Forestry Program for funding this webinar through the Working Forest Initiative. Additionally, we have a few open space network updates. First, we have a couple of grant opportunities which were designed specifically for this network. Our new land conservation mini grant is focused on creating intentional opportunities for networking and relationship building. The neighborhood outreach grant is aimed at using neighborhood scale social networks to help inform landowner decisions about the future of their lands. Applications are being accepted on a rolling basis, and you can view more information and the full request for proposals on the Mass Open Space website. Additionally, the 8th Annual Massachusetts Open Space Conference will be held on Thursday, February 2nd, 9th, and 16th. Stay tuned for more information about this year's webinar topics and how to register for this free conference. We also want to bring your attention to another fantastic conference opportunity. The Massachusetts Land Conservation Conference is going to be held in person on March 25th. Be sure to visit the Massland website for more information. Tonight, we're joined by two fantastic speakers. Robb Jonhson joined the Massachusetts Land Trust Coalition as the Executive Director in 2019. In previous positions at the Nature Conservancy and the Sudbury Valley Trustees, he collaborated with federal, state, local, and nonprofit partners to complete land protection projects and habitat restoration projects in many Massachusetts communities. He has master's degrees in public administration and public health. Christa started her conservation career at the Nashua River Watershed Association, and in 2002, she joined the Sudbury Valley Trustees, where she served as the Director of Land Protection from 2007 to October 2022. She holds bachelor's degrees from Middlebury College, and she has a master's degree in landscape architecture from the University of Michigan. Tonight, Robb and Christa will present a toolkit which was designed by the Massachusetts Land Trust Coalition and Primrose Research Group, LLC, and discuss ways in which the toolkit can be utilized by community leaders to help articulate the economic benefits of land conservation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers, Robb and Christa. Please feel free to take it away.
Great, thanks, Julia. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see such a great group of people, including a lot of familiar faces. I wanted to start really by learning a little bit about who's in the room. So we don't have room to do a round of introductions, but we put together a little poll so we can get a snapshot of who's here. And I'll ask Lynette to go ahead and launch this. She did. Good, thank you. So it's a single poll with 5 different questions, or 4 different questions. So answer them and scroll down. We'll just let the poll go for a little bit. And I'll let Lynette decide when we have critical mass, and she can close the poll and share the results.
All right, we've got about 50 answers now, so I'll share the results.
Great. Hopefully you can see that on your screen. So it looks like we have a really pretty nice range of people here from around the state. Healthy mix from the middle of the state, Central Mass and the Connecticut River Valley. Also a good showing from the Cape, so that's great. And where you sit in terms of your roles. A lot of you are on open space committees, which is not a surprise. Some of you are involved in other town boards and committees. And some of you are also involved with your land trusts, which is great. And then there's some others there as well. And so this is sort of our pre-test question, if you will. have you encountered resistance to land conservation based on the argument that land is too expensive or it takes land off the tax rolls? So almost 3/4 of you have encountered that argument. And have you ever wished you had better arguments to refute the claim? And the vast majority said yes, which is, I guess, why you're here. So you can stop the share. Thank you for doing that. So we also, folks in the land trust community also feel that they encounter this argument a fair amount when trying to conserve land and communities. Often, so many of the deals that we work on require municipal collaboration and cooperation, either because the town is a direct partner in providing funding or ultimately owning the conserved land, or because they're required to sign a conservation restriction that will lie on the property, perhaps held by a land trust, perhaps held by the town. And they have to sign that conservation restriction. In some communities, we know that even getting that select board signature on the conservation restriction can be tricky because they have reservations about the fiscal impact of land conservation on their towns. So actually, before I even joined the Mass Land Trust Coalition in 2019, Christa was already working with a committee of her peers who were grappling with the question of what could we do to come up with a better way to address those reservations and questions when they arise. And that committee met for a number of years, actually over the span of, say, 3 years or so, 2.5 anyway, and deliberated over time what would be some options. Included in doing that was a lot of looking at the literature. What does the best research tell us about the impacts of the fiscal impacts of land conservation? One of the things that was really we are very conscious of is that people are highly focused on property tax impacts of land conservation, but they aren't thinking so deeply about other fiscal impacts of land conservation, including positive impacts. So in the end, to make a long story short, we explored a lot of things we could do and decided that what we wanted to do was to create a PowerPoint and to create a PowerPoint that would be succinct and something that could be edited and tailored to the community where it would be presented. So we ultimately went about the process of hiring somebody to create a PowerPoint with a white paper that would tell us the state of the art in terms of research. And we wanted to make it as relevant as possible to Massachusetts. So let me just share with you what we came up with, where you can find the toolkit if you haven't already checked it out. It's all available on the massland.org website. Go to resources. The bottom tab is the value of land conservation. And what you'll see here is a little explanation of the project. The very first thing you should click on is the user guide. This sort of explains what we have here, and it explains to you how you might go about using it. So read that brief little note before you go further. But then just to highlight a little bit, the meatiest product here is this 20-page white paper that's heavily footnoted. So this is the research, and this is the main thing we really needed Jessica Sargent to do for us. With her economic training, she was able to do a comprehensive literature review that's related, pulling research really that's regionally relevant and summarizing it. And you can, use this however you like. Part of the idea is that it's grounding for you, so you better understand the arguments that can be made, but also something you can provide to those who want evidence for the arguments you're making in the PowerPoint. There's also a little 2-page handout. This is a much briefer summary that is something you could print out as a leave behind. You could email it to folks that you're in dialogue with. And ultimately, it tells them where they can find the full report, which is that white paper that I just mentioned. But what we're focusing on tonight is that PowerPoint. So it's in here in a couple of ways. We have it in a PDF, which is just the full PowerPoint as if you were printing out a PowerPoint. That's something you could use, or you could email it to people. But also we have this editable version, which is a hard word for me to say. So if you click on that, you'll notice you get this screen that says you can download the file. So you can download that PowerPoint onto your own computer, and then you can edit it. And Christa's going to tell us a little bit more about how and why you might want to do that. And I think what I might do now is just go ahead and turn it over to Christa, because Christa is actually going to kind of walk us through the PowerPoint, showing you what's in it and how you can use it. And then we'll take questions as they come. Feel free and put questions in the chat as we go, and we'll find time to answer those at the end.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks everyone for coming tonight. It's exciting to share this with such a big audience. And I hope that you will all go out and share it yourselves after we're done with others in your communities. So like Rob said, we spent a number of years developing this tool. And when we started, we wanted this magical thing that would be property specific, so that if you were going to town meeting and you were advocating for the purchase of a particular property or a conservation restriction on a particular property, you could run the numbers on this magical tool, and it would tell you exactly how much benefit in dollars and cents this would provide to your community. And we quickly realized that was an impossible dream, and will probably never come true, even as modeling of this type gets more sophisticated and more commonly used globally to talk about the benefits of natural services. But I think for our purposes, the data just wasn't quite there yet to dive in that deep. But there is a lot of really good data from New England and from Massachusetts that we thought we could use to kind of put this together. So that's what we have here, and I'm going to walk through it. So this is our title page, and I'm showing this to you in presenter view, and that's deliberate because I want you to see in the subsequent slides, we'll have notes come up on this right-hand panel. And I don't know when PowerPoint made this feature available, but it's great because you can actually see your notes as you're making the presentation, which always seemed to be kind of something lacking in PowerPoint before. So the way this presentation is organized is in three parts, and it's the land conservation benefits first that accrue directly to residents of the community, second to benefits that accrue to local businesses, and third the benefits that accrue to municipalities. And like Rob said, this is a customizable PowerPoint. So if you only have 10 minutes to talk to your select board, and you really want to focus on the benefits that accrue directly to the municipality because maybe it's budget season, you can hide all the slides, the first two sections of slides, and not really talk about those. Or if you were making a presentation to your local chamber of commerce, maybe you want to talk more about how these things accrue to these benefits accrue to local businesses. So you could hide some of the other slides, and I'll talk about other ways that you can customize it as we go along. So this kind of over here, we have sort of just the general overview description of what the project is and how it's organized. This slide gives just sort of the general list of the different types of benefits that accrue across these three different areas. I'm sure some of you have thought about these, how conserved land helps improve air quality and drinking water quality. And so we'll get into more detail about all of those things, but this is just sort of the general overview. And then the first slide in each section talks about the specific benefits that are addressed in this section. So here for resident benefits, we talk about recreation, air quality, moderating local temperatures, improving healthcare, and supporting environmental justice, which may be more relevant in some places than others. So the notes over here talk about how quality of life is such an important benefit to residents of the community, and open space plays a really big part in that. And again, this is why, going back to sort of the magical tool that never came to be, there are a lot of intrinsic and unquantifiable benefits that we get from nature, as I'm sure you all know well. And so I think there's always going to be a certain amount of a little ambiguity or a little like things that we can't actually put into dollars and cents, but that people sort of know inherently benefits them from having open space around them. So we try to articulate that as well in this, even if we can't cite specific economic benefits. So one of the there were some good things that came out of the pandemic, and one of them was that we had a lot of evidence, anecdotal and otherwise, that showed how much open space really benefited people during the pandemic. We saw a lot of migration sort of away from densely populated areas into more rural areas, for better, for worse. But people really found solace in open space during that period, and so we were able to get a little bit of that data into this study as well. So recreation is addressed in two different sections here. It's addressed in this benefits to residents section, really more about how people local to Massachusetts benefit from recreational open space in their communities. And it's very interesting. So the way that this data comes from sort of a national survey that was done by the University of Oregon, but it puts a dollar value on what people would be willing to pay to undertake these or to do these recreational activities. What's really interesting is that that I never really thought about was that it quantifies sort of what people would be willing to pay even if they don't have to pay to do something. So if you can hike for free in your community, that has a value to you in the gas that you save by not having to drive somewhere else to recreate. So there's a lot of kind of interesting ways you can kind of parse this information. And also that if you were willing to pay to recreate somewhere else, but you don't have to, you save the money that you would pay going somewhere else to pay a fee to recreate in another place. So, and it's interesting because people really do, there are strong preferences for people to have these places to walk and hike and go to the beach right in their communities. And I don't think we think about that as much as we may think about sort of dollars that come from tourism activities. But they're actually, there's actually an economic value to having these to the people that live in these places. Improving air quality is, something that we think a lot about. And is more quantifiable. So, we just did a big project right before I left SVT. We did a big project in Berlin, and the people, Berlin's a pretty rural town. We saved 100 acres of forest that's part of a much larger area of already conserved land. And so people in Berlin might not be thinking as much about air quality in their community, but that big preserved chunk of forest land has benefits to adjacent communities like Hudson and Marlborough, which are a little bit more urbanized, much more paved than Berlin. And even for the people of Berlin, they have 495 running through the community. They have a huge mall right at the intersection of 495 and 290. So you're not thinking about poor air quality when you walk around Berlin, mainly because you have this great chunk of forest that has been protected there. So, we tend to think about this maybe more of a benefit in urban areas or more of a problem in urban areas to have poor air quality. But we don't think as much about the areas where we've already preserved enough land to maintain good air quality. And there's in the notes, there are sort of some specifics about how plants do that work of improving air quality. This one is becoming, of course, much more important as the climate warms. Our open spaces have a lot to do with moderating temperature. In Worcester, there was a really interesting study that cited in here when the emerald ash borer showed up in Worcester, and there had to be a lot of trees removed to stop the spread. UMass did a study, a multi-year study, I think, of changes in heating and cooling costs in the community, in the neighborhoods where all those trees had been removed. And there was a really significant increase, especially in the cost of cooling those homes in the summer where they had lost that tree canopy. And, you know, again, this is something we tend to think, maybe you live in a rural community, so you're thinking, well, this isn't that much of an argument to make in my town, but I live in West Concord, which I think, you know, we think of West Concord as a pretty average suburban area. It's pretty densely developed, but it also has some nice green space. But when I go from here to my office, my old office in Sudbury, I notice the temperature difference between West Concord and Sudbury because there's just that much more paving here, and we've lost a lot of street trees in recent decades. So I think this is, you know, this is relevant in a lot of communities. But if it's something that you don't think is going to resonate with the decision makers in your community, you just hide this slide. So improving human health, I think, is also something that's pretty universal. You know, we've seen so many people come out of the pandemic suffering from some mental health issues, you know, particularly young people. And there's so much great evidence, a lot of really great studies about how much being outdoors you know, benefits mental health and of course physical health as well. You can see from the number of footnotes in here that there are a lot of studies cited that you can dive a little bit deeper into, you know, reducing childhood obesity, just overall longevity for people who spend more time in open space. There's really a lot of interesting data. And of course, with the cost of healthcare being what it is in this country, I think this type of information becomes more and more relevant as well. And anybody who's really interested in this particular topic, I would recommend looking into the work of Rachel and Steve Kaplan from the University of Michigan, who did a lot of work in the 70s and 80s and 90s about just exactly how being in nature benefits the brain. And of course, we know that there are a lot of disparities in open space across communities, and that environmental justice communities have people who live in environmental justice communities have a lot less access to nature and open space. So if you know, diversity, equity, inclusion issues are something that you're trying to address in your community, there's a lot of good information in here about just how that inequity happens, and how you can kind of address multiple issues by creating open, protected green space in your community and being very deliberate about where that green space happens. So the second section, as I said, talks about how land conservation benefits businesses. So, you know, primarily in Massachusetts, this is farming, fishing, forestry, but tourism and recreation is also a really important contributor to the Massachusetts economy. So this covers all of those topics in this section. So where we talked about in the residence benefits section, we talked about how residents use and benefit from local open space. This is really more about people coming from outside of the state to Massachusetts to take advantage of our beautiful oceans and rivers and lakes and beautiful places to bike ride. So there's, you know, good data here about what that means in actual dollars. 9,200 jobs in the outdoor recreation industry in Massachusetts, which actually seems even low to me, and I'm not sure, I can't remember what year that came from, but we tried to, and Jessica, who we worked with to create this, we really tried to use the most up-to-date data. There was a lot of studies that kind of go up through 2015. So at some point we're going to have to update this when there's new data available, but I think it's probably still pretty consistent as we sort of bounce back to pre-pandemic levels of things. But a lot of people come, you know, to Massachusetts specifically to recreate and to enjoy our open spaces. But there are also a lot of people that come for other reasons, but then do outdoor things while they're here. And that's captured in a lot of the data too. This also touches on some national data. $7.69 billion in value added. This does account for things like hotel room taxes and things like that. I don't think it really accounts for, all the meals that people are eating out when they come to Massachusetts, and maybe the shopping that they're doing while they happen to be here too. So people are drawn by our natural resources and our recreational opportunities, and then they spend money in other ways too. Of course, farming is really important in Massachusetts culturally and economically, but we have seen a lot of farmland lost in recent decades. 9th most threatened state for farmland loss. And I heard a statistic a couple years ago that Massachusetts now has more lawn than cultivated farmland. So that's kind of depressing. But what's happy is that there are a lot of new young farmers getting into farming. People are adapting to climate change and learning how to grow more on fewer acres and under cover. So we're seeing a lot of innovation in farming here, a lot more trying to keep our produce local and eat locally. So all of that is good for job creation and for public health and for the land. As you can see over on the right there, agriculture industry in Massachusetts directly employs almost 26,000 people and produces almost over $475 million in agricultural goods. So it's not an insignificant part of our state economy at all. And if you have, the other thing I should mention too, another way to customize these slides is if you have a picture of a local farm. Let's say you're using this because you want to make the case that a local farm should be protected. You can just paste your own picture over this part of the slide to make it really, make it more personal to the audience that you're talking to. You can also add your own slides if you want to talk about a piece of property and how it relates to some of these points. You can just add your own slides and pictures and text if you want to do that. Forestry is another big industry in the western part of the state and central part of the state. And this is, I think maybe a little bit more controversial in some places. I know people don't always like to see trees taken down when they're talking about the value of land conservation. But I would also point you, if you're interested in this, to a recent study that came out from the Highstead Center in Connecticut, looking at forestry in New England as a really a major factor in addressing climate change. How we manage our forests and how we manage our wood products really is going to play a big role in how we store carbon and address climate goals in Massachusetts. So with proper management, with managing land for mixed age stands, we can sort of maximize the carbon that's stored in these forests and still be producing wood products that actually, if we focus on producing products and keeping them in Massachusetts, making products like cross-laminated timber, that actually store carbon in the wood. So forestry done right can play a really big role in both the economy of the state and in the fight against climate change. And of course, fishing industry in Massachusetts, this may not be relevant to you if you live in central Mass or the Berkshires or Connecticut River Valley, but certainly if you live on the coast, fishing is a really important part of the culture and the economy. And we really, saving our fishing industry is really something that, if it were to crash, that would have a really big impact on the state economy. And it's not only just the fish that are directly caught and sold at market, but we have a lot of value added products that come from Massachusetts too, from the fishing industry. And then our last section is how land conservation benefits municipalities. And this is where you're going to get the most scrutiny probably from your select board and your finance committee if you happen to present this to them. This section gets into the sort of older topic that some of you might be familiar with, the cost of community services. It talks about how open space can strengthen economic development, increase property values. It can increase drinking water, and a big one is sort of avoided costs. And this is really becomes more and more relevant every day with climate change and with increasingly intense storms and weather events. Conserved land can help us avoid some of the impacts of climate change by stabilizing soils, by mitigating flooding. So that is having, I think more and more town halls are sort of waking up to that reality. And there's so much money now coming through the American Rescue Plan Act and what was the last one called? The Inflation Reduction Act. There are a lot of dollars coming from the federal government through state government and from the state itself too. Even before those bills were passed, we have the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program that provides grants to municipalities to employ nature-based solutions to address some of the impacts of climate change. So using green infrastructure instead of gray infrastructure that's going to have to be replaced and repaired again and again over time. So those are arguments that are really starting to resonate more with local decision makers. When we started off with the question, do you hear the argument in your community that it's too expensive to buy land because it just doesn't fit into the town budget? Well, another study that came out of High-Stead a couple of years ago found that really, even if a town expends a lot of money to buy what feels to them a lot of money to buy a piece of land, it doesn't really have that much impact on property taxes in the long run. You might see a little bump at first and then it sort of dissipates over time. I think the average here, it says, was on a property tax increase, on a property tax bill was an increase of about $2.10 to $3.18. Compare that to, in my town, we just voted to build a new middle school. That's going to add about $1,000 to everybody's property taxes each year. So of course we need schools, and schools get old and they need to be rebuilt. But in some towns it is sort of an argument about not needing to build a new school or add an addition onto a school. So that argument that it's too expensive to buy land, I think you can easily sort of brush that off. And, when we think about what it costs to buy a piece of land 20 years ago compared to now, 20 years from now, any land that we buy is going to seem like it was a bargain. So, and then this cost of community services. So this about back in the 2000s, the American Farmland Trust did a number of studies about the cost of community service, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen these, that show that undeveloped land actually costs the town, a community, less in services than residential development. You hear over and over, local decision makers saying, yeah, but we need the tax revenue from residential development. Well, more residential development means more roads to maintain, it means more schools to build, it means more kids to teach, it means more fire and police needed. So all of those costs add up, and unless your town is only building $1 million plus houses, they're not going to pay for themselves over time. And even those $1 million houses eventually will not be paying for themselves. So we have to ask ourselves too, do we want communities where you can only live if you can afford $1 million house? I don't think so. So what's interesting about this is, and I'd always wondered kind of, well, how does open space actually provide tax revenue to a town? Because these studies always show that there's a little bit of tax revenue from open space. And as someone who works for a land trust, I'm like, well, we don't pay taxes, so our land isn't contributing directly to town budgets. But the way these studies were done is they actually look at excess land. So if you live on a 20-acre piece of land, your house and garage and everything is typically assessed at one rate, and then your backland is assessed at another rate. So these cost of community services studies were taking into account private land that's open and undeveloped, but still is generating some tax revenue. So that's I think an important thing to keep in mind, especially if you're making the argument for instead of an outright acquisition of land, if you're talking about a conservation restriction, because land that's protected with a conservation restriction is still generating some tax revenue for a community. So and I know there's resistance in some towns on Board of Selectmen to sign CRs because they feel that they're maybe taking them off the tax rolls. And then strengthening economic development. Anybody who's tried to hire lately knows that it's a job seekers market. People want to live in beautiful communities. They want to live in communities where there are nice amenities, and they want to live in communities where there's access to open space, and especially younger workers. So there is, even if you live in a rural town, there is, you should be thinking about economic development and how the natural spaces in your community could be attracting particularly younger workers and young families. So what the data shows is that it's true, especially in rural areas and not just in suburban areas. Enhancing home values. There are a lot of communities, especially those, Lincoln is an example of where, they started protecting land in the 70s, and home values are very high there. Homes near open space have become more valuable. And this is a little bit of a tricky argument too, because, we know that practices like redlining in suburban communities were really devastating to diversity in our states and devastating to minority populations. So, this may not be an argument that you want to use in every town. In some towns, people care about this a lot, but it's not necessarily appropriate everywhere. Protecting drinking water. This is like, the Quabbin is the best example of how preserving land around drinking water supply saves money in the long run. Boston didn't have to build a costly water filtration plant, didn't have to upgrade that filtration plant, didn't have to replace that filtration plant. I mean, billions of dollars over time compared to the cost of purchasing land around the Quabbin in the whatever years that was done. But this is true on a local level too. I mean, there are a lot of towns around 495 where wells have been contaminated by salt or other runoff from the highway, and water departments are sort of struggling to find new wells, and buying up forested land and even some wetland is a lot more cost effective than trying to again build costly infrastructure to help your drinking water. Stormwater, again, that's a big problem for a lot of towns, sort of managing runoff and maintaining the infrastructure to take care of that. So protecting land around streams helps with managing stream flow. It avoids more flash flood type situations. And the Charles River is a great example too of where flood control along the rivers has been done using some more of that green infrastructure, and has saved a lot of money for those communities along the Charles. I always think of the Sudbury River too. I think it was 2011 when we had terrible flooding, and almost every east-west road going from the Metro West into Boston was flooded except for one, and that one was around the Sudbury River, where we have extensive floodplains that are still intact, and people were able to sort of stave off the channelization plans of the 1950s, and that natural system is the cheapest stormwater management system you could ever have. So that's all the Great Meadows National Wildlife Refuge. So again, preventing and controlling flooding. And as you can see here, flooding is the most expensive natural hazard in Massachusetts. And we're seeing that, of course, nationally with all storms, hurricanes, just the cost to insurance companies, to municipalities, to homeowners of dealing with the aftermath of these huge storms. And then climate change, again, the flooding, the heat mitigation, invasive plants and insects by, managing our forests and keeping more diverse types of ecosystems intact. We're better protected against sort of the next, tree disease or insect pest that comes along. And finally, we had this at the beginning when we first started, when we were sort of in a final draft stage. And it's one of those things where it's either you get it right away or you don't get it at all. But if you get it, this is kind of an interesting way of just showing that, there's initial cost to doing land conservation, significant cost. But over time, if you sort of add up all these co-benefits of conservation, the offsetting benefits, you get way past the break-even point to the point where you're actually netting positive economic benefits from this land conservation. And so that's it. This is where you could add another slide, sort of, summing up whatever you want, the main point you wanted to make to your audience, or, thanking your local elected officials for all their hard work, or putting in a beautiful scene from somewhere in your community. But that's the whole slideshow, and I'm going to stop my share, and I think we're going to go to questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Christa and Rob, for that informative presentation on the toolkit and ways that it can be utilized. We'll move into our question segment now. As a quick reminder, you can feel free to raise your hand to ask a question or share a comment out loud with our speakers. You can also feel free to enter any questions you have into the chat, and we can read them off that way as well. So I'll give everyone a moment to gather your questions, and we can get started.
While people are doing that, I just want to, it's the little 2-page user guide says all this, but just I really want to reinforce the point that you can really take these tools and completely adapt them however you like. If you design your own PowerPoints, feel free and do your own, but pull some information from these into your own. As Christa said, you can start with ours and just hide some of the slides that don't feel relevant. If you're really skilled, you can replace the pictures by overlaying your own pictures on ours. So there's lots of ways you can tailor this to your own purposes. And we really, give free license to just run with what feels useful, and don't use what you feel would not be helpful in your community.
That's a great point, Rob. So I have a question for you and Christa. What advice do you have for people that are just starting out and are considering using this toolkit in their communities?
I would say test it out on a friendly audience. If you're on the open space committee, and everyone on the open space committee cares about open space, we hope they do, present it to the rest of your committee members, get their feedback. Maybe then you'd go to the next, to somebody else in town who is going to be a little bit skeptical, and so maybe you kind of have the talk over coffee, and sort of work your way up to maybe the finance committee or whoever the thorniest board is in your community. But yeah, start with a friendly audience, and then and work your way up. Or find, if you don't feel like you're the best person to be conveying this message, see if you can find an ally who, is a trusted member of the community, maybe somebody on the finance committee who has some chops and cares about open space and kind of gets the argument, and have them share this with the rest of their board.
Fantastic. Thank you, Christa. Bruce, you have your hand raised. Would you like to unmute and ask a question or share a comment out loud?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm surprised I was able to do that. I have a question on the, how do I put this? The conservation land in my town is not accurate on, I'll call it maps or any site that I look at. How do I get that updated?
So maybe like Mass GIS doesn't have updated information. So whenever you try to use one of the mapping tools, it isn't showing correctly. Well, that's a great question. I'm wondering, Christa, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, that is true in so many towns. If you or somebody in your town, in town hall, has access to a GIS system, what you really need to do, well, the best thing to do is to you create a little shape file of the property boundary and you email it to the folks at Mass GIS. But if you can't do that, I think the next best thing is if there's a survey plan available for the property, you could send that to Mass GIS. And if there's no survey, you can just tell Mass GIS this is conservation land. If you can find the deed, that's great too. And then they periodically update the whole layer of protected open space. But unless someone tells them that something's missing, they don't know. And I wonder, maybe Sarah, I don't know, do you have, I always send it to Dominique Palavan at Mass GIS, but I don't have anybody's email anymore.
We've sent them to, I'm Sarah, work at Mount Graceland Conservation Trust. Thanks, Christa. So we've sent them to Ben at Mass GIS before, and I'll just put an email in here. You could maybe use the generic mailbox though. You could request a data entry form and you could send a shape file like Christa suggested, or you could draw the shape on a topo map, and then they could do the high-powered mapping behind the scenes.
You know,
Okay, so I'm sorry. So it sounds like over the years, so much has been donated to the town. A lot is missing, and I'm just trying to figure out a way to get it updated. That's all.
Yeah, no, it is an issue in a lot of towns because there was so much land protected in the 70s and 80s that didn't, way before we had GIS, that sort of never made it onto the books at the state. So it's just they rely on sort of citizen input and conservation commissions to give them that information. So good that you're keeping an eye on it.
Okay, thank you for the heads up. I'll see if I can, if somebody could, I don't know, figure out a way to send me some infos to the right people to reach out to, I guess.
One thought is, I think that if there is anybody in the town offices in Millbury that has GIS capacity, I don't know if there's a planner or somebody in the conservation office that actually has some GIS skills or just access to the map, any kind of mapping, that would be key. But I don't know, perhaps your a nearby land trust, or like Greater Worcester, for example, land trust might have some ability to help a little bit. Because most of us don't have the skills to like create a map. Some of you do, which is awesome. But this is something that'd be awesome for you to take the initiative to get fixed. And
yeah, I've actually had a lot of luck creating maps, but with the conservation zones being incorrect, people are questioning me on my trails that I've created.
Oh,
so I guess I'll get with the planning board and I'll try to figure out a way to move further with conservation mapping statewide, I guess, because that's where all the confusion is. All right, thank you for your help. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Bruce. We have a couple of questions in the chat. So Rob and Christa, how do you convince the select board in a town which 2/3 of the land is protected, 1/3 of that is in chapter 61, that more is better?
Rob?
Well, I was thinking a little bit about this, and one of the reasons I was thinking about, I was going to ask Christa a really hard question, and you're sort of asking it in a different way. Because one of the things that I puzzle about a little bit when I hear Christa's go through the whole presentation, it's like, yeah, but what difference does this 1 30-acre parcel make? And that goes back to Christa's wishful thinking for a magic tool, but it's like, we already have so much. What is, do we really need to spend money on 30 acres more? And even if we did, is it really going to change all of that you've just walked through? But I think part of what, particularly in a town like yours, something to be thinking about is the impact of fragmentation. So one of the slides, we went through it quickly, but one of the slides has to do with how the forest products industry is adversely impacted by fragmentation, which was an interesting thing I hadn't really even thought about before. But you lose viable forestry when land gets fragmented. And you could read the white paper to find out more about why exactly. But same is true for some of the recreational benefits, be it snowmobiling, hunting, some of that is only there because there's this patchwork of protected land and unprotected land that isn't developed yet. And as soon as we start developing it, the fragmentation sets in, and those values that you had and enjoyed in your community, you didn't even perhaps know what they were worth. But as soon as the land's all fragmented, you start to lose that. So, that's one thing I think is one potential argument. If your community values a lot about the way it is, think about how chopping it up would adversely impact that.
Right, that's it. Yeah, that's a really a good response. And because we know we're not going to save every acre, and we shouldn't save every acre, but we have a housing crisis in the Commonwealth, and people need affordable places to live. So it's about being strategic. Does that 30-acre parcel link to other parcels that are already protected and avoid that fragmentation? Rob and I saw a great presentation yesterday from Michelle Mannion at Mass Audubon about the state climate action goals. And, I was struck because we're supposed to be meeting net zero carbon by 2050, and 85% of that is supposed to be done by reducing carbon inputs into the atmosphere. But 15% of that has to be done by carbon sequestration. And so we're doing about 7% now with the open space that we have. But so we have to, through better management of our open land, be eventually sequestering more carbon. And I know that's not going to be an argument that you can make in every town, and some people aren't thinking that far ahead yet. But for people who are kind of thinking about how do I make a difference as an individual or in my community when it comes to climate change, I think thinking about being a part of that 15% is makes you feel like maybe you are part of something that's making a difference.
Thank you, Rob and Christa. Charles, you have your hand raised. Would you like to unmute?
I think I am.
Yes, you are.
Okay. I guess this is sort of two but related questions. One, I would love to see Christa's dream come true, where there is something that could be tailored to a specific land acquisition. I envision a spreadsheet where you fill in the blanks of costs, benefits for a specific parcel, with tax rates, school costs, and come up with something that you can then take to town meeting and say, here's why we should acquire this land. The other is regarding particularly something like Chapter 61 land, where the town has a limited time to exercise a right of first refusal. What sort of mechanisms are available to hold that land? Because realistically, it can take a year plus to convince town meeting that they should commit to it.
Do you have a local land trust in your community?
We do.
Yeah.
But it is, our budget is very limited. We cooperate with SVT. I'm with the Hopkinton Area Land Trust. We do not have funds that we can jump in there preemptively.
I'll make a pitch for SVT then, because SVT does have a land protection revolving fund that we just used it twice in the past year in Berlin and Boxborough for both. Well, one was a Chapter 61 withdrawal, and so we stepped in, bought it. They got the town meeting vote, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So keep that in mind. There are also loans, you can get no interest loans, I think, from the conservation fund is also one way. And I know, it's a lot for an all volunteer land trust to kind of step in and undertake a transaction like that, where you're taking on, a certain amount of risk. But if you have a regional land trust that you can partner with, that has some experience in doing projects like that, I would say that's, but yeah, Chapter 61 is so fraught and challenging, and the best way is, the best thing to do is to be talking to those landowners 10 years in advance of when they want to take it out of Chapter 61.
Thank you.
Julie, I see Stephen O'Grady has a question in the chat. Maybe we should do that before Ed.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question from Stephen is, Christa, the increase in residential property values because of open space protection can be a double-edged sword, right? Sometimes neighbors are opposed to conservation because they don't want their taxes to go up. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Because they don't want their, oh, right. Well, that's, yeah, I think that gets back to the study from Highstead that shows that the taxes, really, they don't really go up all that much for a typical land acquisition project. And even if they go up a little bit, it does sort of tend to even out over time. So Stephen, I would encourage you to take a closer look at that study, which is included in the white paper citations. But did you say specifically the neighbors don't want their taxes to go up?
I think he's asking more about that slide where you're talking about how it does increase property values. So they don't want their property value to go up.
Right. Okay, sorry.
So that other study is about townwide property tax impacts, and this is about the abutter impacts.
Right.
Their lives are going to get better, and they don't want that because they don't want the tax impacts of that.
Yeah. And I think that, I don't know, I haven't, because most towns reassess, only every so often. So, we don't want people to have to move because their property taxes are too high, but I don't, I don't think it's so much I don't think people see that much of an increase in their actual property taxes, but when they go to sell their homes is when you really see the benefit, the increase in value. Does that sound right, Rob?
Well, it kind of makes sense, but I don't know if anybody else has a comment on that, because there's a lot of wisdom in this group. Maybe others have a thought about that. Yeah, I see, Ellen.
So Ellen Anderson, I'm the chairman of the Board of Assessors in Petersham, and I think what you just said about when you go to sell, you'll find you'll do better, but that's not one of the factors that people, that typically assessors look at when they do the statistical analysis. So that you won't find that happening or giving you any trouble until you go to sell, and then it'll be a good thing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Wonderful. Ed, you have your hand raised. Would you like to unmute?
Yes, I wanted to comment on a presentation that was done by Christa and Dan Stimson yesterday from Sudbury Valley Trustees. And a lot of the data that they talked about and showed, I think would be useful to this same group. And maybe Christa could take a minute to talk about that. She did a great job, and I thank her very much. Thank you.
Wait, you said yesterday? Hi, Ed. Where was this?
Yesterday.
Oh, I didn't do anything with Dan yesterday. We did an annual meeting. We did, we presented our new story map. So SVT did a, Dan is the Assistant Director of Stewardship at SVT and also our GIS guru. And way back in 2014, SVT did a regional prioritization plan to try to be more strategic about where to protect land with, well, primarily with the most, the most ecological value. So that was getting a little bit outdated. There's a lot of new data about areas to protect for better climate resilience and other things. We're also thinking a lot more about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we wanted to redo our prioritization plan. And we did that with a grant from the Land Trust Alliance and the Open Space, and a technical grant from the technical support grant from the Open Space Institute. Redid our prioritization plan and also worked with the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga to create a story map, which I don't know how many of you have seen story maps, but it's basically a website that incorporates mapping and photos and other graphics and kind of tells a geographic story. So we created this with help to tell the story of our new prioritization plan. Is that what you're talking about, Ed?
Oops,
Oh, I
you
think you're
accidentally muted.
Sorry. It says I'm muted, but I didn't think I was.
It was probably at the MCA meeting yesterday, Christa.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
right, okay.
I didn't mean to say that you were there personally, but your work was there.
Oh,
And
okay, thank you.
And it is a great tool.
And let me see if I can figure out how to find it. I always forget where it is, but if I can find it, I'll put it in the chat.
Maybe while you're doing that, should we take Al French's question?
Yeah, absolutely. Al, feel free to unmute.
Okay. It took me a while to figure out where the hand raising was. Mine is a comment on 2 questions ago. The question of how much is enough is one that dogs you arithmetically, and you work with land protection. My hometown, there's only so many acres in the town. So every time you add more open space, your percentage of open space goes up, and it becomes harder and harder. What I use is a technique of saying it's not only the absolute percentage of acres, it's also per capita. I try and use the concept that people have moved to your town and do move to your town on a perception of what the town is like for quality of life and open space. So as your population increases, you need to add more open space, even though the percentage goes up. So by using per capita, it's a little bit of a sophistic approach, but at least it's one way of answering a really difficult question, because there's no way, the more you preserve, the higher that percentage goes up, and it's often used against you by other people. Thank you.
You know, that makes me think of something that I was thinking about a little bit earlier that we also hear is you know, that we're competing with land that's needed for other things, and depending on what part of the state you're in, housing is the number one concern. Are we removing more of our limited land supply, taking it out of play for development that may be needed? And housing is one of those needs. So, you know, in some communities, there's also this concern about, you know, Steve asked about increasing the property value of the land next door. In some communities, it's about green gentrification. You know, if you create a beautiful new park, it's going to increase the rent values such that people are displaced. And this has been seen in some communities around, like in Atlanta, for example, where they did a beautiful green belt. Suddenly, some people couldn't afford to live in their neighborhoods anymore. So, you know, I do think it's important for us to be mindful about the other community priorities. When we go in and talk to a group of a board in a town, we want to be mindful about the context of the other things going on in that community and some of the competing needs of the community. One of the things that we're trying to think about at the Land Trust Coalition is how we can provide some ways for people to think about the housing crisis in this state a little bit more creatively. How can we partner at times? How can we talk about ways that we are actually supportive of development in certain parts of town while we're also prioritizing conservation of other parts of town, so that we're not seen as just single interest, you know, narrow-minded advocates, that we're actually thinking comprehensively about communities, and we want to be part of community solutions. So that, I think, is a whole nother area that's wildly important and will probably grow in importance because land is finite.
Thank you, Rob. Christa, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
No, sorry, I was busy putting the link in the chat.
Yes, the link to the story map is now in the chat, everyone, in case you want to check that out. Charles, you have your hand raised? Oops. There you go.
A second to, and hearty second to Rob's comment. I think those of us who are engaged in land conservation also need to be forceful in our communities regarding providing housing opportunities. Our town is considering accessory apartments, duplexes, to improve the housing stock without eating up more land. And I think, you know, that's something we all need to be involved in.
We're actually going to have a little bit of a focus at the Land Conservation Conference in March on housing and conservation together, and how it can be not in competition with each other, but some creative collaboration. So that'll be the focus of the plenary panel at the conference, and there'll be a handful of workshops on that topic as well. And it looks like maybe a field trip to see a partnership project. Yeah.
Thank you, Rob. Peter, you have your hand raised. Would you like to unmute?
Yeah, it took me a while to figure out how to raise my hand too. So, so tying together the issue of tax rates, housing, et cetera, I've been thinking for a long time and talking with people about I think there's a player that's missing from the field, and they're a player that affects our towns a lot as far as economic development, et cetera. And it's the regional planning boards, the Council of Governments, for example. Oh, and the issue of large contiguous open spaces, especially in the context of like Biomap 3, which identifies lands of priority conservation interest, but that go across town boundaries. I'm wondering if we don't want to see if we could get the regional planning agencies creating a 5-year regional open space plan where they look at their whole region in terms of biomap 3, in terms of economic development, in terms of housing, et cetera. I'm thinking that this regional open space plan then is an alpha document that feeds the local town open space and recreation plans. And I'm even thinking that this regional open space plan would be a great vehicle to deliver funds to towns to help them acquire lands for conservation that have been deemed at a regional level to be a priority for conservation purposes. That lets the regional conservation, the regional planning agencies do the balancing between housing needs and open space requirements. And then we have agencies that we can go lobby and work with, and the regional land trust groups could be working then in partnership with an agency that has a fair amount of say and leverage over what's going on, because that developers are in there talking to them all the time. And we just need a vehicle to get open space up in their plans, because they hold a lot of power, a ton of power, all the power. So I'm done.
Peter, thank you for that comment. And one thing, we had a meeting last week where one of our speakers was Trish Settles from the Central Mass Regional Planning Council, if I got their name right. But she actually flashed on the screen some old maps that I'd forgotten about, which were state-funded. All the regional planning associations around the state were funded to create regional open space priority plans, just exactly what you just said. And the project actually challenged them to map priority development areas as well as priority preservation areas. And I'm putting a link to one of them, which is from the Southeast Regional Planning Authority. And there probably are such maps that exist, even though they're now 9 years old. It may be worth looking at those. Trish actually put some on the screen for a couple of towns in Central Mass, and it was very interesting to be reminded of what those tell us. And even though they're based on data that's now a little bit outdated, I don't know if you get bonus points for citing them in a grant today, but to me they still seem highly relevant because a lot of thinking went into them, a lot of community input. There's also something a little bit more recent from but without the sort of government imprimatur, if you will, but Essex County Greenbelt, for those in Essex County, the regional land trust up there did a wonderful regional open space plan, and they've taken it out to each of the communities in their county. And they tell us that most towns are now using that regional map in their open space plans as a reference to say, this is how our open space priorities fit within a regional context. And I think it's completely the way we should be thinking, not at the scale of 351 towns. It's far too important to think across town lines.
And I would just add to that, I mentioned the municipal vulnerability preparedness grants earlier, and they do encourage cross-town collaboration on projects, so which can include land acquisition. I think you get bonus points if you team up with other towns.
Great, thank you so much, Rob and Christa. Dan, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks. I have a couple of comments, but I just want to go back to Rob's last comment about not thinking about 351 communities. Is that what you mentioned? So
that's the number, yeah.
That's where the power is, though. We got a problem in Massachusetts on land use control. It happens by town. So these FERCog, like FERCog in Western Mass here, and these other planning agencies, they write plans all the time, but they have no regulatory authority. So, you know, when my hair was brown, I heard about we really need to change land use in Massachusetts. So this problem's been going on for a long time. So I don't hold out a lot of hope for it in the short term. But I think we should be thinking regionally and across town borders, and we can do that in our open space planning efforts and collaborating with our neighbors. And like in the North Quabbin, we have the North Quabbin Regional Landscape Partnership, and we work together across municipal boundaries, and we think like a region. And I guess that's one of the things that I wanted to say about the PowerPoint is that it can be tailored and we can talk like a region. So I thought that it definitely has some power there if we speak in regional terms, because obviously here in Wendell, we don't have a chamber of commerce. So we won't be presenting to them, but we don't even have a lot of businesses in town, but we can think regionally and talk about you know, all the positive attributes that you mentioned and the benefits in the PowerPoint. And I guess as Christa was going through her presentation, I just thought, you know, we do this work all the time, all of us. And I just thought to myself, we take a lot for granted, like what nature and the earth provides to us from, you know, our each breath that we take, to the water we drink, to the food we eat. And there was a long list of benefits. And I think we've got a lot of power in this presentation and this long list of benefits that the natural world provides to communities and humans, if we can get out ahead and not get the conversation hijacked by tax loss and we need more revenue. This is where we could get to shift that conversation, get out in front of it. And then I think you can change hearts and bring people together around a project. Because I think in a lot of conservation projects, people aren't talking about, you know, the dollars and cents. There's a number, but a lot of folks are thinking about in their heart of hearts, do they want to protect this land? Yeah. So it's a tool, right? This presentation is one tool, and this will help the folks that only see land protection through the dollars and cents and a potential impact on the tax base. We can, you know, that could help there. So
yeah, that's a really good point. It reminds me, Christa, something we didn't really say, but something that we thought a lot about at the beginning of this is, who is the audience? And we ended up kind of agreeing that the audience is not the people who tend to be way over here against land conservation. And it's not the people who are really for it all the time. It's the sort of convincible skeptics is actually the audience that might respond to this information. So it is important to think about anything you know about your audience before you dive into this. This may not even be needed. You know, if your audience is all rah, ready to go, you may not even need this data. And it's probably not going to be helpful for that one person on the finance committee who's against spending a nickel for anything all the time, because, you know, if you know you're not going to convince somebody, it's probably not worth giving them an opening to cut your, you know, pull the rug out from under you, you know, with a smarter argument than your own. So it's really for people who are open to learning, who might be convinced, who have concerns. But I also want to turn to Sarah's good question about in the chat. Is there a way to use this that doesn't really require a projector and a screen and turning on a PowerPoint? And, you know, for more informal conversations or for settings where technology doesn't rule the day, is there a way to kind of use this information? I think there is, but I'd be really interested in other people's thoughts. But for me, I would stick the white paper and a couple of the 2-pagers in my bag, and not necessarily bring them out, but have a conversation, and depending on how the conversation goes, maybe leave that behind. And probably be thoughtful about the parcel in question or the town in question, and really just have a couple of the key statistics that seem relevant and talk about them. And you might be talking about them in a way that's more conversational than, but being able to talk a little bit about how recreation, or maybe there's an example you can cite, this a family that recently moved to town and why, or a company that recently moved to town and why they might have done that, and what we're seeing in the real estate market and what's driving that, the quality of life in our town. Maybe there's a farm stand that's doing particularly important things for your town, and talk about how it's important to keep them going. A farmer who needs the fields that he leases, I think really thinking about bringing these data down to reality is really critical. And I think you're making that point, Sarah.
And to build on Dan's point about all we take for granted, maybe before you sit down for an informal conversation with someone, you go through the slideshow and you remind yourself about all the co-benefits of conservation, because maybe people are thinking like, oh, what do we need more trails for? We've got a lot of trails, but they're not thinking about all these other benefits that the open space provides. So it just can kind of help be your mental checklist as you go sit down and have a cup of coffee with someone.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rob and Christa. So we have a few minutes left. Are there any final questions or comments that anyone has for our two speakers?
Well, I see Doug's comment at the bottom of the chat, which is completely true. I completely agree. And were that we could change that, the planning laws in this state do make it amazingly easy to develop roadfront lots with road frontage. Very hard to prevent, and extremely hard, as it sounds like to change the zoning law, and it's been attempted for years and years. But
thank you, Rob. Let's see, so I'm not seeing any additional comments. Rob and Christa, do you have any final remarks that you would like to share with the audience tonight about the toolkit, or any advice that you have for them about potentially using it in their communities? Oh, we actually have one question from Gail. So before we get to that, Gail, would you like to unmute?
Okay. Come on.
Yes, you're unmuted now.
Okay, all right. Well, I just wanted to say that I was at a Lean Land Trust meeting, and there was a young woman and a young man doing a presentation on Foul the Woods. And they were talking about trying to have connections between the corridors for the animals, wildlife, and everybody else in the world besides humans. And so I was just thinking that you guys were talking about a regional planning. Now here we have a group of people that I never even knew this about Foul the Forest. It's pretty cool. And so they're picking up data on wildlife crossings. They're trying to find the pinch areas for wildlife, being killed by cars, and trying to figure out what we can do as humans to encourage the animals to move through a safer area. And so that seems to go along with all this open space priority as well. So I just wanted to mention that. And that's pretty much it. I don't know. I also, there was a lot of points brought up, but the points were brought up, but I didn't really know if anybody, it was just, if it's all new or if it's all being said, but for me, it helps, like, even if the point, there's a lot of discussion, if the main point was there, if we kept track of that, then maybe we could look at some of them and come up with a solution. But if there's a lot of things being brought up, my brain just gets scattered and I can't focus on anything. I don't know if that's a good suggestion, or if I'm being a jerk or what, but it just would help me out, just a little bit of, I was wondering if there was any minutes, or is there a way to get what was said tonight, especially this chat? I don't know.
Yes, we can definitely make sure to send out a copy of the chat. And Rob and Christa, do you have any additional comments that you would like to add to that?
Not to that, but just generally that we would love feedback from people, especially if you do take this and go out and share the information with others, and get pushback or welcome with open arms. We don't really have, one of the flaws in our project is that we haven't really come up with a good way to make sure that this is being used, other than Rob and I shopping it around. So please let us know if you poke holes, whatever. But especially if you go out and do share it with your community.
Okay.
And along the same lines as that, we also have a evaluation link in the chat right now. If you have a moment to fill it out before leaving tonight's webinar, we greatly appreciate it. Your feedback on this webinar and the toolkit is very valuable to us. And it's now approaching 8 o'clock, so we can close out tonight's webinar. I want to make sure to thank Rob and Christa for presenting tonight, and I want to thank everybody that tuned in tonight for asking such fantastic questions and joining us. Be sure to be on the lookout for a follow-up email that will have the recording to tonight's webinar, along with some resources as well. Thank you all again. I hope you have a fantastic night. And that's all. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.